Some observers believe that when Israel destroyed the Syrian nuclear power plant in 2007, their plans used sophisticated cyber attacks to defend air defense. A series of systematic attacks in 2008, including Al-Qaeda websites launched. They're initiated persons or entities owned, though in most indicators, it's very likely that a Western nation. In 2011, the United States contemplated but did not launch a cyber attack on Libyan anti-aircraft defenses in conjunction with its close air support of the resistance to the regime of Muammar Gaddafi. In today's lecture, we look finally at the highest level of our pyramid of conflict. This is the level where we consider a cyber war between nation-states, that is, countries with sophisticated cyber capabilities. We've yet to see an all-out cyber war in the real world, thankfully, and perhaps we never will. But as the examples I opened the lecture with indicate, nations are increasingly considering cyberspace as a separate domain for conflict. If we do have a cyber war, it is likely that the conflict will emerge as a collateral part of a true kinetic war. When and if a full-on cyber war begins, its destructive capacity will likely rival that of a physical conflict. But we can't be sure of its true scope until we actually experience one. So, what is war in the cyber realm? It has a clear legal definition in the real world, but in the cyber world there is no consensus yet on what constitutes the kind of aggression that would justify a hostile response. And if you're the leader of a nation that has just experienced a cyber attack, that's a big problem. In fact, the only thing we really are sure of is that some form of cyber war is inevitable. And when it does happen, we're going to look to the physical world for analogies. There is a reason that all of our words about cybersecurity are reflections of the reality in the physical world. Think, for example, of the word virus, or the phrase logic bomb, a program left behind in a computer, something like a mine that will explode on command. We can't help but borrow images and words from our experience in the physical world. That's the reality we are comfortable with and that we know. So in this lecture, we're going to try and think about this definitional problem. We'll try to define cyber war and think about how we will know when or if we've been attacked. We'll also ask about whether, when, and how a country can respond. So let's start at the beginning. What would be an act of war in cyberspace? Consider the following hypotheticals, all of which are reasonably realistic. Imagine that an adversary of the United States, either known or possibly unknown, disrupts the stock exchanges for 2 days, preventing any trade, or introduces a logic bomb into a military command and control system, disabling it, cutting off communications between the commander and the units in the field, or implants a worm that slowly corrupts and degrades data on which certain military applications rely, say, for example, by degrading global positioning system location data so that the accuracy of our weapons is affected, or probes a Pentagon computer to map its structure and identify its vulnerabilities, or disables an entire industry, say, part of the electric grid. Now, some of these, like probing the Pentagon computer, are clearly analogous to espionage in the physical or kinetic world, and we wouldn't think of them as acts of war. Others, like disrupting our military command and control system, look just like acts of war in the kinetic world. But what about that middle ground? Is leaving a logic bomb behind that slowly degrades GPS accuracy like espionage? Or is it like planting a mine in another country's harbor as a preparation for war? Is causing a brownout by degrading the electric grid an attack? We've only begun to answer these questions. For now, the Pentagon has decided that the traditional laws of armed conflict apply in cyberspace just as they do in the physical world. Though unsurprising, if not the traditional world rules, then which ones? It is by no means clear that this decision will work out, or even what it means in practice. But the Pentagon isn't waiting around to find out. In fact, America's warriors are already busy training in virtual cyber cities, getting practice in how to defend U.S. infrastructure like our electric grid and the transportation system against cyber attacks. Still, the questions raised by the Pentagon's definition of cyber war need to be answered. For example, is the battlefield of cyberspace limited to geographic areas of military conflict? Or does U.S. Cyber Command have authority to execute cyber military operations against adversaries wherever they may be? That makes a huge difference when, for example, Al-Qaeda websites are hosted on servers in, say, Malaysia. Are those servers military targets or not? More fundamentally, adopting the traditional laws of armed conflict defines an act of war as any act that is equivalent in kinetic effect to a military attack. Under this definition, an attack on the electric grid would be an armed attack if the cyber assault had the same effect as, say, a missile attack on the electric grid might have. The logical consequence of this analysis is also part of the Pentagon's policy, which is to authorize the U.S. military to use any weapon in its arsenal in response. After all, if an enemy attacks us with tanks, that doesn't mean we have to use tanks in response. We can use airplanes. So if an enemy attacks us with a cyber weapon, we have said that we reserve the right to answer with a real-world weapon of proportional effect. Now, when the policy was first publicized, the caricature headline in one press report was, "Obama threatens to nuke hackers." That isn't quite right. A nuke would not be allowed, but only because it would be disproportionate, like answering a BB gun with a 500-pound bomb. But at heart, the headline does capture the broad outline of the policy. We don't have to fight back just with cyber weapons. If we accept the Pentagon's de facto definition of war, then, the fact of the matter is that as of today, the world has not seen a true cyber war. The Russian attack on Georgia is a close approximation, however. In August 2008, Russian troops fought Georgian troops regarding a disputed border area between the two countries. During the course of that conflict, a number of cyber attacks were made on Georgian internet services. A distributed denial of service, or DDoS attack, prevented the Georgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other official Georgian sites from using the internet to convey information about the attack to interested third parties. Remember, a DDoS attack is one that uses multiple computers and accounts to flood a computer server with messages and overload it, preventing any legitimate efforts to connect to the server. In other instances, the cyber intruders corrupted the code for various official Georgian websites, defacing them with pro-Russian messages. I'm told, though I don't read Russian, that those messages were often quite rude and scatological. In this particular conflict, the website of the Georgian president was attacked from 500 IP addresses. According to the United States Cyber Consequences Unit, which is a nonprofit research institution here in America, these attacks were actually carried out by Russian civilians, so-called patriotic hackers, who had advance notice of Russia's military intentions and were aware of the timing of Russia's military operations. The civilians were, in turn, aided by elements of Russian organized crime in their efforts, including the Russian business network that we talked about in an earlier lecture. These Russian criminal networks, they provided access to their own network of controlled computer botnets for use in the attacks. In addition, the main social media chat room that was used to organize the attacks, that chat room had the domain name stopgeorgia.ru, where RU is for Russia. That domain name was registered to an address that's located just blocks from the headquarters of the GRU, which is the main intelligence directorate of the Russian armed forces. This suggests the strong possibility that Russian intelligence agents may have helped in coordinating the attacks. The attacks were effective, not only in preventing Georgia from getting its own message out to the world, but also in preventing the Georgian government from communicating with its own people in order to respond to the Russian military invasion. The cyber attacks on Georgia represent the first use of cyber weapons in a combined operation with military forces. But even in this context, it's not clear whether the attacks standing alone met the traditional definition of an armed conflict. Though highly disruptive, it's difficult to say that their effect was equivalent to that of a kinetic attack. In the end, no physical damage was done. So this is only thought of as a cyber war because it was tied to the Russian invasion. The Russian-Georgian War demonstrates the limits of our practical knowledge about cyber conflict between nation-states. Repeating a theme from an earlier lecture, in the cyber domain, unlike the real world, the attacker may not be so readily identified. In the end, the critical question in a cyber war will be, who attacked us? For even though we have grave suspicions about Russian intent in the Georgian War, the reality is that we don't have conclusive identification of official Russian responsibility. In addition, we need to be cautious in defining what cyber war is. After all, what is sauce for the goose is also inevitably sauce for the gander. Some, for example, have argued that Iran might view the Stuxnet virus as an armed attack, which allows it to use military means in its self-defense. In late 2012, that fear may have become a reality when a virus known as Shamoon was launched. It wiped out 30,000 computers used by the Saudi oil giant Aramco. And another DDoS attack took several major American online banking systems offline for several days. Most observers have tied these attacks to Iran and saw them as a response to Stuxnet. They were so significant that U.S. Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta actually gave a speech warning about an impending cyber Pearl Harbor. And so, time and war wait for no man. Even while national security lawyers and scholars seek to define cyber war, the national security apparatus must move forward, developing an understanding around key practical issues. How will we fight in cyberspace? And who are we likely to fight? So let's think first about how. You may remember our discussion about the lack of distinction in cyberspace. That is, the problem that all the ones and zeros in the logic layer look alike, and you can't tell a weapon from a cookie recipe. That problem, combined with the borderless nature of the internet, can lead to a host of almost insoluble issues regarding the use of cyber force. Consider the following sample of questions. First, international law allows the targeting of combatants who are participants in the war. Killing armed combatants is a lawful act under international law, and it's not murder. But who is a cyber combatant? Is a civilian hacker an armed combatant? How about a civilian employee with cyber responsibilities in a non-military government agency like the CIA or its Russian equivalent? And what about the unwitting individual whose computer has been hijacked? If they're combatants, then the domain of lawful warfare is as broad and as wide as cyberspace itself. Another issue. Certain targets, like hospitals, are immune from attack under international law. But IP addresses, Internet Protocol addresses, they don't come with labels that say, I am a hospital system. And most server systems are inextricably intertwined with one another. How, if at all, can a military attack ensure that it avoids damage to privileged targets? And if it can't, does that mean that all cyber attacks are illegal? Under the laws of war, combatants must carry their arms openly and be readily identified as combatants by the uniforms they wear. The main purpose of this is to allow opposing military forces to distinguish between combatants and non-combatant civilians and target only lawful combatants. Yet almost no cyber warriors wear uniforms, nor are they readily distinguishable from non-combatant civilians. Indeed, one of the principal tactics of a cyber warrior is to hide his actions behind the veneer of seemingly innocent civilian activity. An innocuous email, for example. If these cyber soldiers don't abide by the laws of war, does that mean that they, like terrorists, are not entitled to the protections of those laws if they're identified or even captured? The laws of armed conflict also respect the rights of neutrals. World War I was, at least in part, exacerbated by Germany's violation of Belgian neutrality. In the cyber domain, however, successful attacks will almost always violate neutrality by using servers and computers that are located in non-combatant countries as a means of masking the attack. Only a fool would, for example, make a direct attack from a US server to one in China. Yet, due respect for the principle of neutrality suggests that this is precisely what is currently required by international law. Apparently, lawyers in the Department of Justice in fact believe that network attacks on servers outside of a formal war zone require the host country's permission, and that absent the permission, the attacks are unlawful. Now, you can see why this is confusing, and why increasingly lawyers are being asked to manage cyber war. Whether that's a good thing or not is the next question I want to consider. The nature of cyber operations allows for the increasing centralization of command and control. For analogies to this trend, we don't need to look far. One of the least well-kept secrets in America is the CIA's operation of a covert drone campaign in the borderland between Pakistan and Afghanistan. If press reports are to be believed, the program has been successful in steadily constraining action by the core al-Qaeda leadership and slowly whittling down their numbers. One little recognized consequence of this new practical reality has been a restructuring and centralization of command and control. Because the drone program acts at a distance, and because it is mostly operated from inside the United States, we've seen the development of a system where key targeting decisions are being taken by increasingly more senior officials. Indeed, it's been reported that when any significant chance of collateral damage from an attack exists, the go-no-go decision is typically being made by a general officer and is sometimes even made by the Secretary of Defense or the President. Cyber weapons, just like drones, act at a distance. They're often deployed with forethought, and they're part of a pre-planned series of military actions. As such, they are, like drones, far more likely to be controlled by more senior authority than is typical for a military engagement. It is difficult to overstress how significant this change truly is. In war, as we know it in the physical world, decisions are typically made by a commander on the scene in relatively close geographic proximity to events. One consequence of that situation is that legal judgments about proposed courses of action will be made by military attorneys who are attached to the combat units at the front and who have a situational awareness of that conflict. By contrast, when decisions about whether or not to launch a cyber weapon are made by a central authority and higher-ranking officials, we see an increasingly important role for lawyers. Where there is time for reflection, lawyers are far more likely to intervene. Many observers, of course, will see this as a good thing, but it is likely to produce some odd results. As we noted a moment ago, Department of Justice lawyers have tentatively concluded that as a matter of law, U.S. cyber attacks must respect the neutrality of other countries, and that therefore they cannot transit through servers in neutral countries. Now, to non-lawyer technologists, this seems to elevate form over substance. We might as well say that the United States will disarm and not conduct cyber offensive operations at all. In their view, it is impossible to conduct a successful operation when neutrality is strictly respected. Thus, while there are benefits to centralizing command and control, the proximity to an unwieldy bureaucracy also poses challenges for the management of military operations, when the bureaucrats are behind the front lines and they're detached from the field of battle. Let's turn now from how a cyber war might be waged to ask our second question. Who are we likely to fight in a cyber war? Or, to put it another way, who are the most effective national actors in cyberspace? In a word, China. As the Department of Defense's 2010 report to Congress concluded, quote, numerous computer systems around the world, including those owned by the U.S. government, continue to be the target of intrusions that appear to have originated within the People's Republic of China. These intrusions focus on exfiltrating information, some of which could be of strategic or military utility. The skills required for these intrusions are similar to those necessary to conduct computer network attacks. Scary, huh? Indeed, China has demonstrated significant cyber capabilities in recent years. You'll remember from Lecture 4 the case of GhostNet, the intrusion that targeted the Dalai Lama and other countries in Southeast Asia. GhostNet was just one part of a vast systematic effort being made by the Chinese. Let me tell you about a few more of China's cyber incursions from the last years, and believe me, I could double the number and still not run out of stories to tell you. Titan Rain and Byzantine Hades are the formerly classified code names given by the United States government to a series of coordinated attacks on American government and industrial computer systems. The attacks began in roughly 2003, and they have in some form continued to this very day. A number of the Chinese websites that have been used as portals for Byzantine Hades intrusions were registered in China using the same postal code that is used by an electronic espionage unit of the Chinese military. According to American investigators, these programs have stolen terabytes of data, including the designs of the F-35, America's newest fighter jet, from the defense contractor who's building the plane. This is also the program that got inside the computer of former U.S. Defense Secretary Robert Gates, an embarrassing incident that we talked about in an earlier lecture. A different, more technologically troubling display of Chinese capabilities occurred in April 2010, when the Internet was hijacked. Traffic on the Internet is typically routed through the most efficient route. Servers calculate that route based upon a kind of call and response interaction with other servers. In effect, downstream servers advertise their own carrying capacity and current load, soliciting traffic. On April 8, 2010, China Telecom began broadcasting erroneous network traffic routes. As a result, American and other foreign servers were instructed to send Internet traffic through Chinese servers. In the end, according to the United States China Economic and Security Review Commission, roughly 15% of the world's traffic was routed to China. This included official government traffic from the United States, as well as the traffic from any number of commercial websites. And of course, as the traffic went through China, nobody knows what happened to it. Perhaps nothing. Or perhaps it was copied and stored for later analysis. The Chinese said it was all a mistake, and they've apologized. Sometimes, the attacks are just stepping stones to bigger and better things. In December 2011, the FBI told the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that the Chamber's servers had been penetrated by intrusions from China. Until the FBI told them, the Chamber had no idea it had been compromised. Now, the Chamber is not normally thought of as a repository for classified information. Most of its activities are done in the open as it lobbies for legislation. So this time, most analysts think that the Chamber was attacked as a way of getting at other major American companies. Using the email addresses and other personal information harvested from the Chamber of Commerce, the intruders would be better able to craft a host of sophisticated spear phishing attacks against the CEOs, CFOs, and CIOs of the Fortune 500. We may never learn how successful those follow-on attacks are, but we're sure they're coming. One of the more unusual efforts made by China appears to have been an attempt to hack the patches and get ahead of the defense. Here's what I mean by that. Typically, Microsoft and other companies release patches to known software vulnerabilities on a fixed schedule. The schedule is so well established that some call the second Tuesday of every month Patch Tuesday, because Windows users can expect a routine monthly patch of vulnerabilities as an automatic download that day. To make the patches that they ship work more effectively, Microsoft gives advance notice of the patches to a select group of cybersecurity companies. With proof of concept code that they receive in advance, those companies can prioritize and test the fixes before installing them to provide protection to their customers. But what if the hackers had advance notice of the patches? Since even the patches can be reverse engineered, hackers who were inside the system and had advance notice of what patches were coming out would be well positioned to develop their own offensive countermeasures that get around the patches before they're even installed. Something like that seems to have happened to the March 2012 Microsoft patch. The proof of concept code for the patches was found on a website in China, before Microsoft's official patches had shipped to the security companies. Now, it may have been an error, or an insider leaking the data, or a hack from the outside. Nobody knows. Once again, however, a sophisticated operational plan that seems to have originated in China created a vulnerability in America and around the globe. Now, finally, and perhaps most chillingly, in 2012, the security firm RSA was penetrated by an intrusion that compromised the company's Secure ID system. This Secure ID system was, at the time, the single most common piece of security hardware in use by banks and private companies. Maybe you've seen one. It's this little token that periodically generates random 6-digit numbers. So when you go to log into your bank or access your company's servers from off-site, in addition to your regular login, your username and your password, you're also asked to type in your 6-digit number, which will be matched against the one held by the company or bank that you're trying to connect to. If they do match, you're considered authentic. And if they don't, then the company or bank thinks that your password has been compromised. So Secure ID tokens are an important extra layer of security. Though details of this attack remain very unclear even now, the intruders apparently compromised the random number generation algorithm so that they would be able to infiltrate the companies that use the RSA Secure ID token. Just a few weeks later, Lockheed Martin was attacked by someone using the stolen RSA data, who attempted to gain remote access to their system. The attack is said to have been thwarted, but the focus on a defense contractor, rather than on a bank, seems a clear indication that the RSA hack was done by a sovereign nation, not by cybercriminals who would have used the data to break into bank accounts instead. China denied responsibility for the RSA hack, but of the 334 command and control servers used by the malware, 299 were located in China. In fact, to be clear, except for the one mistake that they apologized for, the Chinese have denied any role in all of the attacks we've been discussing, and also for all of the dozens of other known attacks that I haven't listed. What are we to make of these Chinese activities? How should we assess them? Are they significant threats? Should we credit the routine denials that China makes? Well, first, though it is a bit controversial to say so, I think that there is really little basis for accepting Chinese denials of awareness and responsibility. I was particularly amused by a recent propaganda error by the government. Chinese news was broadcasting a story about China's military system on TV. It was typical fare, a summary of new things that the military was doing and such. But suddenly, in the midst of the story, there was a segment on cyber war. And that segment included footage showing a computer screen. And on the screen itself, you could see cyber attack commands directing an attack against a server in the United States. Oops! Shortly after Western news outlets noticed the TV segment and translated it, the government recognized its mistake and the video was pulled from Chinese websites. In fact, the evidence is so overwhelming that, in my view, the Chinese have only the barest fig leaf of deniability. Nobody who seriously studies the issue doubts that the attacks on American systems are part of a systematic campaign that could not really occur without Chinese state approval. And what is true for China is true of other nations and non-state organizations who've demonstrated equally threatening capabilities. Russia's prowess has been discussed earlier. It resides mostly in their patriotic hackers and the criminal groups that they co-opt. In addition to the Shamoon virus we talked about a few moments ago, Iran is thought to have been responsible for a DDoS attack on American banks in September 2012, one that cut many Americans off from their online banking services. In short, there is no lack of potential enemies on the horizon. All of which leaves us with one final question. If these exploits are the ones we can identify, typically after the fact, what about the ones we're missing? By definition, we can't know what they are. To paraphrase former U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, they are known unknowns. But the thought is clearly a daunting one. And so, we're on the horns of a dilemma. Or more accurately, more than one dilemma. The laws of armed conflict are not readily translated to cyberspace. They were developed for warfare involving armies and munitions and are in the cyber domain inherently ambiguous. We have no idea, to add another question to the list, what the cyber equivalent of mutually assured destruction is. Maybe mutually assured disruption. All of this vagueness leaves us deeply unsettled. We know that cyber war is possible, but we have no idea what rules, if any, will apply. That is not a formula for a stable international regime where the rule of law prevails. It is instead a formula for the Hobbesian law of nature. In the end, while some think that cyber war is imminent, others, including me, think that cyber war with another country is neither more nor less likely than a real-world kinetic war. We may fight a cyber war with China, but only, I suspect, if we fight a real shooting war at the same time. On the other hand, it does appear that cyber espionage of the sort that China practices is rampant. But whatever you think, I hope this lecture has impressed upon you how transformative cyber war might be. It might have the same destructive effect as a physical war, but we may not know we've been attacked, or who attacked us, or how we are allowed to respond. And so, having now finished our survey of the dangers lurking in cyberspace, we'll turn to trying to figure out how we might address and mitigate those dangers. We'll begin in our next lecture by talking about the government's role in regulating cyberspace. I'll talk to you then. So, we've just spent several lectures outlining all of the vulnerabilities in the cyber domain and identifying all of the bad actors, from criminals to other nations who might want to do harm. So the question that must be pressing in your mind is whether or not the cyber realm can be made safer, and if so, how? As we will see in the next few lectures, there are a number of ways in which society is slowly bringing order to the chaos. That may not be an altogether good thing, because with order often comes control. But we begin in this lecture exploring various ways and efforts to make cyberspace a safer place. Not perfectly safe, but safer. So today, we'll start our exploration with a look at the debate in America over government regulation of cybersecurity. Many in Congress and the executive branch are calling for the government to set minimum standards for cybersecurity and to regulate the network. Others, including me, are skeptical that would be a good idea. By the end of the lecture, you'll know enough to be able to decide for yourself whether we're missing an opportunity or exercising wise restraint. Now, the first question, of course, is a basic one. Why do some people think we need any security regulation at all? After all, we don't have regulations that say require you to put bars on your windows or locks on your doors. Why do we need rules that say you have to put firewalls on your computers? The most substantial reason we might need regulation is because our national security requires it. Imagine you're General Keith Alexander, who's the commander of U.S. Cyber Command at Fort Meade in Maryland. Where do you get the electricity that runs the servers you use to do cyber defense and offensive operations. You may have many on-site backup generators, but your primary source of power is a private company, Baltimore Gas and Electric. Now, if Baltimore Gas and Electric goes down for a week because of a cyber attack, that would be a great hardship for the citizens of Baltimore and the surrounding suburbs. But for Cyber Command and the National Security Agency, which is also located at Fort Meade, that would be a significant national security concern. And of course, the problem is not limited to BG&E and Cyber Command. Across the board, our military response is critically dependent on cyber capabilities for transportation, for communication, and for power. So, some see the lack of private sector cyber protection as a problem that threatens our very national existence. Indeed, as Michael Chertoff, the former Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, explained in testimony that he gave to Congress in February 2012, quote, "Left to their own devices, few private companies would invest more in securing their cyber assets than the actual value of those assets. Yet in an interconnected and interdependent world, the failure of one part of the network can have devastating collateral and cascading effects across a wide range of physical, economic, and social systems. Thus, the marketplace is likely to fail in allocating the correct amount of investment to manage risk across the breadth of the networks on which our society relies." In October 2012, when he spoke about the topic, U.S. Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta echoed that sentiment, saying that America was facing an imminent cyber Pearl Harbor. That, in a nutshell, is why some U.S. senators were so anxious to pass a bill regulating network cybersecurity, and why President Obama wanted to issue an executive order for cybersecurity. So what are we to make of this argument? It certainly seems persuasive. If the threat of a cyber Pearl Harbor is real, who would not want to take any step, including regulation, to prevent it? After all, if the threat of economic disruption on a grand enough scale is real, then the U.S. government would be disabled from responding to external threats, or at least severely dissuaded. For example, if China gets into a conflict with Taiwan, then the U.S. might be prevented from intervening militarily by virtue of the vulnerability of our critical infrastructure. Or alternatively, the NSA might be preemptively disabled by a takedown of the BG&E electric grid. Note, though, that this entire line of thought equates vulnerability with risk. And yes, vulnerabilities exist, even for catastrophic critical infrastructure attacks. And the consequence of such an attack would be severe. But vulnerability isn't risk. You have to find someone who actually wants to implement a threat and has the capability to do so. Right now, there aren't a lot of someones out there. Just reflect for a moment on what it took to make the Stuxnet virus operational. According to public reports, which I hasten to add are the only basis for my knowledge, the creators of Stuxnet had a detailed insider's knowledge of the way in which the Siemens controllers worked. This suggests either active assistance from the company or a significant intrusion there in the first instance. That knowledge was not, however, enough. A broad-scale cyber espionage program, active over the course of several years, known as FLAME, was also required to closely map the Iranian cyber systems to discover the precise contours of the vulnerabilities to be exploited. Mock-ups of the centrifuge system had to be built, using, allegedly, centrifuges received from Libya, back when Libya was trying to be nice to the West, and then tests run to prove the viability of the virus. 4 separate zero-day exploits had to be identified and incorporated, a wildly profligate use of 0 days. And once the program was ready, then some type of espionage, a human agent, social engineering, where someone was tricked into putting the malware on through, say, a spear phishing attack. Some of that was necessary to get the virus inside the Iranian system. Plus, of course, someone had to have the cyber Jedi skills to write the code in the first place. This is assuredly not the stuff of a small-scale hacker group or terrorist cell. It's the product of a nation-state. So, do we really think China's going to do that to us when we can do it to them in return? I don't mean to sound overly sanguine about the prospect of a catastrophic cyber intrusion on critical infrastructure. Clearly, the vulnerabilities do exist. Indeed, in 2007, the U.S. National Research Council said that high-level threats from sophisticated adversaries could result in a digital Pearl Harbor that would require a very quick and active response from our IT vendors and users. But what is striking, at least to me, is that this prediction was made in 2007, which is almost 3 generations ago in terms of cyber processing power. And yet, nothing that bad has happened. And the first person to speak about a cyber Pearl Harbor that I'm aware of was the Clinton-era director of the CIA, John Deutsch, back in 1996. That's an awful long time to be on the hook for Pearl Harbor. Of course, we must be painfully aware of all of the people who've gone wrong in predicting technological developments. The folks who said planes would never fly or that battleships would never be sunk by airplanes. And the equally dismal record of those predicting future political developments, including the prediction that the Soviet Union would never fall. But we can only work with what we have in front of us, and the bottom line on the cyber threat is this. In my judgment, today, right now, the only actors capable of even thinking about a large-scale, crippling cyber assault are other nation-states. The likelihood that they will do so is roughly the same as the chances of a large-scale kinetic war, meaning a war with guns, bombs, planes, and the like. If you think we're going to get into a shooting war with China anytime soon, then by all means, be afraid of a cyber war. But if you think that the chance of a kinetic conflict with nation-state peers is slim, then I think so too is the chance of a cyber war. And for now, today, the chaotic actors who we might fear more, like anonymous or terrorists, well, they just don't have these capabilities. They are likely to get them sometime in the future, but exactly when they will is deeply and radically uncertain. It won't be tomorrow. It may not be for 5 years, and it might not be for 20. And so, without a better case for critical infrastructure catastrophe as a realistic possibility and not just a theoretical vulnerability, some are not persuaded that a cyber regulatory system is needed. Now, there are also other reasons to think regulation might be necessary, more traditional ones relating to market failures and economics. To understand this part of the problem, let me start with a short game. You don't need anything to play except your brain. It's actually a multi-part game, so here's the first part. I want you to think in your mind about everything you personally do in cyberspace. Think about how you use the internet to collect information, how you Google, how your iPhone tells you where the nearest Starbucks is. Think about how you use cyberspace to communicate, all the emails you send and the video conferences you may do using Skype. Think of how you post your status on Facebook and upload your pictures to Flickr. Now think about the commerce that you do on the internet, the books you buy from Amazon, the shoes you get from Zappos. And now we add in some of the other stuff you do. The political campaigns that you work on, the hobbies you talk about, the news you get, and the doctors you consult. And if you're on the cutting edge and have, say, one of those wired homes, think about those uses, like the ability to turn on the heat from a distance before you get home. Think of all those things that you do in cyberspace. And now imagine giving it all up. How much money would it take today, right now, right here, cash on the barrelhead, for me to convince you to completely give up cyberspace? This is for real. This is not give it up a little and get the information from your wife or your brother or your friend. This is really and truly give it up completely. If you want to make a phone call, use a landline phone. If you want to buy a book, you have to go to a brick and mortar bookstore, assuming you can find one today. To buy theater tickets, you actually have to go to the movie theater. So, how much money would it take? What would you take? Would you accept $1 million? How about $5 million? Now, I often ask this question of students, and the average amount that seems to be something like $2 million. Now, your value may be more or less. The lowest I ever heard was $500,000, and the highest was a pure refusal for any amount. But let's use $2 million as our number. And now let's assume you're 40 years old and that you're going to live until you're 90, so for another 50 years. That makes the math easy for me. And that gives us an annualized value of $40,000 a year. That's what economists would say is your utility valuation of internet access. So now here's the second part of the question. How much do you spend annually to get that access? If you're like me, you spend maybe $50 a month for your DSL line. That's the American average, or $600 a year. Add in maybe another $1,000 a year for your cell phone. Talk about the value proposition of cyberspace. You spend $1,600 a year for something that you value at $40,000. That's pretty good, right? And now the next question, the third part. How much do you spend protecting that investment? Maybe you have a firewall system that costs you $40 a year, if that. So in some way, you personally think that your chances of being subject to an intrusion are less than 1 in 1,000 each year, $40 over 40,000. By now, in this series of lectures, you've probably figured out that you're kidding yourself. And now the closing part. Let's change the perspective from you personally to all the public and private corporations and entities in our lives. Consider all the things that they do in cyberspace from a business perspective. They keep records of government activity, they communicate with their constituents, they keep track of projects, schedule meetings, hold on to the personal data of their taxpayers or customers, they follow the markets, and their engineers use it to operate the wastewater treatment plant. School principals send out letters to parents and post grades, Zappos sends shoes, and Amazon sends you books, while Walmart tracks all of its thousands of products. If they were forced to do without the internet, the engineers would actually have to be at the facility, and taxes would be assessed and collected by regular mail. Media readers would go back to paper records, books would be sold in bookstores, and operational costs would skyrocket. Yet, businesses also systematically underinvest in internet security. Why is that? Because in the short term, it saves them money. They don't need to take the cost of that underinvestment into account. It's what economists call an externality. That's when private goods cause public harms. In other words, when something I do privately affects you. A classic example might be if I kept a dog in my house. His barking may protect me, but if it disrupts